The Sony a7 III is not a new camera, but it is a newish camera as of August of 2019, which is the time of this recording. Now, my D7100, which is sitting here on the desk, is my daily driver. That's not on the tripod. You're actually watching this through the a7 III with the 24-105 lens. Now, I'm thinking about jumping over to the Sony world because I've been shooting Nikon for about 13 years now. I bought the D7100 a while ago, and around the D7000, D7100, Nikon was really getting into the video world. I mean, they've been with video for a little bit, starting around, I think it was the D90 that had their the first video feature in a DSLR. But ever since then, I was hoping that they'll expand better into the autofocusing space by incorporating the phaser type autofocus within their cameras for the sensors, so when you go into live view, you're not using the contrast based autofocus. But unfortunately, fast forward some years later, I actually rented the D850. Not that much of a change compared to the D7100 in terms of the autofocusing with video, so that was a little bit disappointing. Sony, on the other hand, they've been investing into their mirrorless cameras, and I'm going to look at, what it's like to use a Sony system. And someone like me, I feel like I play in the consumer space, so I'm not a professional, but I guess more in the prosumer area. It just allows me to slap a camera on a tripod, have a one-man crew, and be able to do some kind of presentation and be able to have nice focus. But that's enough blabbing. Let's go on to talk about the pros, cons, and the quirks of the Sony a7 III. If everything goes to plan, I'll create a two-part video where I'll be covering the Sony a7 III in this mini review here, and then the second part will cover whether I'll make the jump to the Sony system, and if so, go full frame or stay with APS-C. A while ago, I rented a Nikon Z6 mirrorless camera, and I'll do a little bit of comparison with that as well as my D7100, which I currently own. If you're interested in the Z6, I do have a video on that, so I'll put a link in the description below. Let's move on to some of the quick comparisons. Compared to the Nikon Z6, the Z6 has a top LCD screen that shows you the status, such as shutter speed and aperture. That's very helpful. The a7 III does not have this, and one of the things I ran into is if the camera is hanging from my neck and I look down, I don't have the ability to see the current settings very quickly, whereas if I did have the LCD screen, I can do that without picking up the camera. And sometimes if I pick up the camera and it's still too close to the body, the viewfinder will think that my eye is up to it and will activate the viewfinder and disable the rear LCD screen. And yes, if you have one extra screen to power, that's more usage on the battery, but I think in this case, the benefits outweigh the cost. Some of the reviews will say that the rear LCD screen or the viewfinder, or both, will have low resolution compared to some of the other cameras. For me, this is not a big issue. As a matter of fact, I think the lack of the top LCD screen is a bigger problem than the resolution of the screens and the EVF. The Nikon Z6 surprisingly does not have the ability to add a battery grip. Now, for a camera in this price range, $2,000 for the body, I'm kind of surprised. My Nikon D7100, which when you bought new, was $1,200 at full price, and that offered the ability to have a battery grip. Now, there are multiple benefits of having a battery grip, right? As you're holding the camera, sometimes your pinky doesn't really have anything to grab onto if the grip is too small. And this provides an additional part that you can grip with, and if you're doing vertical shots, it makes it easier. But for me, the power function itself, where you add a second battery into your camera, that's pretty helpful. The a7 III has 2 card slots, although rated for different speeds, but you at least have the option of shooting with 2 SD cards. Now, if you go with the Nikon Z6, you only get a single XQD card slot. Now, compared to an older DSLR like the D7100, this is kind of like night and day. It's kind of hard to compare because the cameras are so different. Now, the biggest difference I see between the two is the autofocus during video, when you have the phase detect autofocus in live view, essentially, whereas you don't get that in, let's say, the D7100. When I bought the D7100, I was kind of hoping that Nikon would have done that sooner because they had the D7000 as well as other DSLRs that had videos, and when I rented the Nikon D850, the focusing in video wasn't that much better compared to the D7100. Alright, so we're here in the studio with the D7100. I'm just aiming the camera at the table and not really moving, yet the camera struggles to focus and attempts to correct what was already in focus by hunting around. Now the face detection is on, so I will go ahead and turn the camera around. Hopefully I'm in focus. I don't know because the screen doesn't flip out. But as I'm walking around, even the distance between myself and the camera is the same. If I have the full-time AFF autofocus during the video, it struggles to focus. We're doing the same test as I did with the Nikon D7100 as well as the Z6. Walking around the studio, a little bit unstable, handheld, moving around and seeing if the autofocus is locking on to my face as I'm walking around. I also want to see if these LEDs, which is pretty much all the lights here in the basement, will flicker. But the important tests, at least for me, are these soft boxes. I have regular bulbs in there. They're Philips A19 bulbs, I believe, and I want to see if they flicker once I turn them on. But that's next. Stay tuned. And here we have the lights on. It looks like it's doing pretty well. We're shooting at ISO 200 f4 at 1/60th of a second. I'm boosting this up to 1/200th of a second, just stepping up little by little, and then I'm going to come back down. So this is 1/50th of a second, 1/30th of a second. So far it looks pretty good. No banning, no flickering. DSLRs are also more power efficient than mirrorless cameras, and in addition to battery life, if you accidentally put your camera in the bag and you left it on, a mirrorless camera would actually heat up and you feel the warmth around the camera body. And if you compare that to a DSLR, well, DSLRs run cool to begin with, so no big deal there. Focus peaking, listed as peaking setting in the menus, is available in manual focus, but not in autofocus. In general, Sony's menu system is a bit less intuitive than Nikon's in my opinion, but they have a couple of tricks up their sleeves if you poke around. I don't know if I take advantage of all the focusing modes. I find that either I use the AFS plus flexible spot or AFC plus lock-on AF expandable flexible spot. Say that quickly 10 times in a row. Wide with IAF is nice, but it's not foolproof. If you're selecting the individual focusing points, I feel like the joystick is a little bit hard to control compared to the D-pad that Nikon uses. Some people love this, so try it out for yourself and see. After I returned the camera, I found out that you can use the rear LCD screen to select your autofocus points while you're using the EVF. This might be a nice alternative if you don't like the joystick. It looks like it's similar to the Canon RP's touchscreen feature while using the EVF, and I tried this a little bit during the time I was at the Photo Plus show in New York City. One thing I do miss from Nikon is the autofocus and manual focus selection lever. You can switch between the two pretty easily without looking, whereas on the A7 III, there is a button that you can map to switch between manual focus and autofocus through a menu system. One nice thing about mirrorless cameras is that the electronic viewfinder can guide you through manual focus. So in this case, a magnified view of your subject will allow you to see if you're in tack sharp focus or not. You can adjust the focus magnification time to either 2 seconds, 5 seconds, or no limit, depending on how long you want that magnified view to be on. Or if you want to totally turn it off, you can do that through the AF Assist in the menus. On Sony lenses, there are some interesting features to note. For example, in the 85-1.4 G Master lens, there is a declickable aperture ring, so you can adjust your aperture on the fly, and if you're doing video, you can declick it so that you can smoothly shift between apertures. Do you guys take advantage of this feature? Let me know in the comments below. I find that sometimes I accidentally bump into this ring, but I guess you just get used to it. There's also a focus hold button, which is pretty nice. I know it's bad. I don't utilize the AF on functionality, so I guess you can use this in place of that to hold focus. Changing ISO with the D-pad changes it in 1/3 stops, whereas changing it with the rear dial will adjust the ISO in full stops. That's a very nice touch. One of the things I looked at Sony for is the ability to do videos and autofocus effectively. So in addition to speed, one thing I look at is the autofocus motor noise. And the lenses that I rented, which is the 24 to 105 as well as the 85mm lens, the 85mm lens, being a large 1.4 aperture lens, has quite a loud motor. It's not as loud as the Nikon AFD lenses, but it is louder than the AFS. However, the 24 to 105 is pretty quiet, so I don't see that as being a problem if you're using the internal mic. As for the 85-14G Master lens, I haven't shot that in a quiet place with the AF on plus the internal mic on the camera recording, and unfortunately I don't have any samples covering that scenario. But if you're using an external mic to record, the autofocus motor sounds shouldn't be a problem at all. In Sony's latest firmware version at the time of this recording, which is version 3, that gives us the ability to do interval shooting, enabling us to do time lapses without an external remote. This is nice because in the past, you do have to buy an external remote to trigger the shutter release, but now you can do it right from the camera. This was one of my complaints when I was looking at Sony from shooting a Nikon. Nikon's had this for a long time, and I thought Sony could have easily incorporated this since it's essentially software. Well, better late than never. To help do the time lapses, Sony allows you to shoot directly in 16:9 aspect ratio so you don't have to crop in post. I also noticed that the recording time is limited to 29 minutes according to the specs. It would have been nice if the camera can continue recording even if it has to roll through multiple files. I didn't go crazy on the IAF testing, but I've heard it's not available in video mode for the A7 III. It does have face detection from what I've heard if you're doing video recording, so at least you have that. When I was testing the A7 III, I did have older memory cards, so shooting at 120 frames per second was limited to the 60 megabits per second setting, but I can't do 100 megabits per second. Another thing that I noticed is that the video record button is a little bit hard to reach being next to the viewfinder. If you're trying to hold something with your left hand in front of the camera lens, and you're trying to start the recording with your right hand without shifting your whole palm, it can be hard to reach with the thumb, at least with my hands. After the reno, I did see that you can remap the shutter release button to include the start video record function, so at least there's a way around that. And finally, if you have selected movie mode on the camera and you're trying to change between, let's say, program, aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual mode, you do have to go through the menu instead of changing it on the mode dial since the mode dial is already set to movie. And that's all the time we have for today's video. If you reached this point, I appreciate you watching the video. I know this is kind of a longer video than normal. There's a lot to cover with the Sony A7 III, and I barely scratched the surface of this camera, right? I haven't talked about resolution, I haven't talked about the detailed stuff about the lenses themselves, color grading, which is something I want to really get into, all kinds of stuff. Coming up, I'll have a part 2 to this video about possibly jumping over to the Sony system, as well as going either full frame or staying with APS-C. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.